Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to today's session. I can see a few of you have already joined us, so thank you for taking time. Thank you for taking time out of your day to be here with us today. We really appreciate it. As more people are joining in, feel free to say hello. You can say hi in the chat box. Let us know where you're joining us from, your designation, and your company. My name is Ivy Towet, and I will be walking you through today's session. Before we dive in, for those who may not know us, Valuemax Consulting Limited is an ISO certification and management systems consultancy with over 20 years of experience, uh, working with organizations across Kenya, East Africa, and beyond. And one way that we give back to the community as Valuemax Consulting is through webinars like these ones, and it's completely free, and we always host it monthly. So I can see one Rose, hi. So feel free to say hi in the chat box as we wait for others to join. So Rose, maybe you can tell us where you're joining us from. Or maybe you can also unmute and say hi. Okay, thank you for that. Let me briefly introduce today's topic as we also wait for the rest to join us. So today's topic will be looking at ISO 45001 2018, the International Standard for Occupational Health and Safety Management Systems. In today's session, our speaker will take us through three main areas: what ISO 45000 is and why it matters, including why workplace safety needs to be managed as a system, not just promoted through posters or one-off policies. Two, understanding the standard clause by clause. A walkthrough of the 10 clauses from context of the organization to leadership, planning, support, operations, performance evaluation, and improvement. And the third is implementation process. So he'll take us through practical steps on how an organization can actually put this standard into practice. So to take us through this, I am pleased to welcome our speaker for today, Franklin Odwor. Franklin has done an excellent work in putting this presentation together, and he brings a great clarity and depth to how organizations can approach occupational health and safety right way. So over to you, Franklin. You can go on.
Thank you, Ivy, for the wonderful introduction. And allow me to proceed to the presentation. I'll just share my screen. Ivy, kindly confirm you're able to see my screen.
Yes, we can.
All right, thank you. All right. So my name is Franklin Odur, and I'm an ISO consultant here at Valuemax Consulting Limited. And I'll be taking you through the ISO 45001 2015, which is a standard, basically giving guidelines or the requirements on how you can implement an occupational health and safety management system. So our topic today, of course, will be looking into enabling organizations to systematically manage occupational risks as well as safety risks. So this is basically our agenda for today. Um, we're going to look into what is ISO 45001 and why it is significant and why it is important to organizations, as well as the benefits it can offer to organizations that have taken the initiative to implement it. We're also going to understand the clause by clause requirements that the standard provides for organizations that are implementing the system itself. And then we're also going to guide you on how to implement an occupational health and safety management system within the organization. So first of all, workplace injuries and ill health, they cost organizations far more than direct medical compensation. This is after you're factored in, of course, whatever comes in after the injuries have taken place. For example, we are talking about the downtime. This will be, of course, affected uh, through the operational costs that are incurred when maybe the production is delayed. Maybe the technician who was handling a machine is the one that has been injured. Now, depending on the competency, of course, we'll be looking into replacing the technician, which will incur cost to the organization. And also, of course, when the machine is not being operated, this will result in delays in manufacturing or production, which in turn leads to downtime. Also, we have reputational damage, which will be caused by this. That is, if the regulatory bodies have decided that you have violated the safety rules or regulations that they have assigned within their policies. Also, we have legal exposure and, of course, worker morale. When the staff within the organization maybe get an idea that you are not taking the measures that are required to ensure that they are safe while they are working, then this will reduce their morale when showing up for work, as well as their productivity. Also, we have a statistics, which is from the Directorate of Occupational Safety and Health Services. Remember, this is a body charged with occupational uh, deriving policies. Maybe they define policies and determine what organizations are able to adhere to within the nation, that is Kenya. So they indicated that there are a total of 2,508 workplace accidents, which were reported as of, that is the first quarter this year, as of March 31st. So you can imagine how much incidences have been reported to them. And you can really see the scope of, or rather the negative aspects of the not engaging your work or your workers in ensuring that they are safe within the workplace. So most of these incidents, of course, are traced back to gaps in identification, control, as well as oversight of hazard. When you don't have proper identification measures in place, whereby you are able to identify the potential hazards that have occurred, and also coming up with risk assessment measures that can be able to control those that have occurred. So also we're going to look at what organizations are doing currently, having a safety poster or even a policy statement. For the safety poster, this could be maybe a helmet. Okay, we can also talk about the cold rooms area, where you are required to have proper PPEs, like the gloves and also the clothes that will protect you from the cold. So having these posters, of course, is not enough, or even a policy statement stating that you are adhering to safety measures is not enough. So you need a structure. You need also to conduct safety efforts and to ensure that these incidents do not recur. And also, we are going to look at how safety performance will improve when everyone is involved. That is leadership as well as the workers within the organizations. So the ISO 45001, 2018, the 2018 version, is an international standard for occupational health and safety management system, and it replaced the Occupational Health Safety Assessment Series, that is the 18001. This was withdrawn, this was withdrawn in 2021, and the one we're currently using is the ISO 45001. So basically, this is built, the ISO 45001 is built on a high-level structure, which of course is the same as the one that the ISO 9001 and the ISO 14001 uses. This will make integration easier for organizations running multiple management systems. So ISO is an in full is an international organization for standardization, which is basically a globally recognized institution that offers these standards. Basically, the standards are there to ensure that each and every process within organization is standardized. Like, for example, an organization implementing this for 5001 here in Kenya will have the same framework as the one implemented in, let's say, China, UK, or even in the US. So basically, we have the same framework. The only thing that will be different, of course, is we have to understand that every business has a different environment. For example, the political factors that will affect a business in Kenya are not the same as the ones that are not the same factors that will affect a business in, say, Uganda, Tanzania, or even in the Middle East. So the framework will be the same, but only the operations will definitely differ, but not that greatly. So basically, the high-level structure will help you integrate the occupational health and safety management system with, of course, the ISO 9001, which is on the quality management system, as well as the environment management system. So this will also, of course, avoid the duplicates. When, for example, if you have a policy document, you won't need a different policy document for quality, another on safety, and another on health. So you'll basically be able to interpret these three aspects, that is on quality, the health, and safety, and have a single document describing how you'd want them to be implemented within your organization. So, and also for the management system, that is the ISO 45001. This is applicable to any organization of any size and also any sector, from a small manufacturer to a multinational. So it does not define or whether you have an 10 employees, 20 employees, or even 100, this standard can still be implemented. Remember, we are focusing on the framework. The operations might be different, but the framework still remains, or rather the structure still remains the same. And also, this standard is a certifiable standard. As I had mentioned earlier, ISO is a globally recognized body. And once you attain the standard, of course, you'll be through an accredited certification body. We are able to audit and certify that you are conforming to the standard requirements. So the purpose of the occupational health and safety management system is to provide a framework for managing the risks and opportunities under the occupational health and safety sector. So implementing this system will help you conform to the ISO 45001 standard, enabling an organization to manage the risks and improve its performance. So just on a light note, the ISO 45001 standard is basically a guideline which gives you requirements on which has guidelines or requirements on how you can implement an occupational health and safety management system. So at this point, we will look at one of the processes or rather frameworks that is very key when it comes to implementing the management system. This is the PDCA cycle, and it's basically stands for the plan, the do, and the check, and then you act. So in the planning phase, we are able to determine the occupational health and safety risks, as well as the opportunities. And then we're also able to look at we're able to establish objectives and the processes necessary to deliver results in accordance with the organization's policy. So remember, with the standard requires you to have a policy. And once you've had a policy, remember, a policy is basically the intent of the organization and the direction you're willing to take. So be it in the manufacturing, construction, all these companies are set up with an intent in place. So once you have decided on the policy, you'll be able to determine and assess the risks and opportunities that are likely to affect how your business is going to operate. After this, you'll be able to identify the potential hazards that can affect the organization. And then in so doing, of course, you also be able to come up with objectives, which are basically the goals that the company is willing to achieve. After that, we have the second phase, which is in doing. This is where we now implement the processes that we had planned. If we have determined and come up with the risk assessment, we'll be able to come up with ways on how we are going to conduct the risk assessments. We come up with we are able to assign a representative and also determine the cycles or how often the risk is going to be updated or assessed. Then in the checking phase, we are now able to monitor and measure the activities and processes with regard to the policy, the objectives, and afterwards we are able to report on the results. Then lastly, in the act phase, we are taking actions to continually improve the performance and to achieve intended outcomes. So remember, this will solely rely on the data you have collected from the checking phase. Because when we are monitoring, we are collecting data. For example, we are evaluating on the effectiveness of a risk that we had come up with. How has it performed? Has it helped improve any process? Now, we coming into those conclusions is when we are able to, of course, come up with actions that will help us improve. Then we have the process approach. Every standard and system has a process approach, which is basically tied to inputs, the activities that are acted, the activities that go on these inputs, and at the end of the day, of course, we have the outputs, which are the results. So the sample inputs could be on the materials. For example, we have the suppliers, they have the raw materials, or rather even for the company itself, they have the technical specifications that they require from these suppliers. And also we have the customers, there's customer requirements, which can also be an input. This includes ensuring that the staff within the organization are competent enough to conduct the tasks that they are assigned. So of course they will want to know if your staff have the necessary competence. That is will include, of course, the governments and also your clients. For the regulatory requirements, we have the business permits. Do you have work permits, for example, in the construction sector? You need to obtain permits from, say, NEMA and also all those other regulatory bodies in order to start your construction. So we will also look at the outputs. And with the outputs, of course, we can have the reports or the services. For example, for the suppliers, they supply you with the raw materials. And within the activities phase, you'll work on these raw materials to produce the end results, which of course will be a product or a service, which will be in turn once again supplied to the end user, which of course will be a customer. For the governments, of course, one of the requirements will be a business permit. They will require you to establish a business using the right channels. That is having the right business permits. Also, even on the safety violations, you need to, they have established safety rules that need to be adhered to. For example, with the DOSH and the OSHA 207. So they'll require you to have these requirements. And at the end of the day, that is what you'll be able to provide as evidence that you are complying to what they have said. So at this point, before I proceed, maybe if there's any question or a clarity that anyone will seek, I would like to welcome any comments or questions from your end. Okay. Since there's no any other comments or questions, let me proceed now to the clauses. So for the ISO 45001 or any other ISO standard, we basically have sections, which basically forms the structure that every other organization has to follow in order to ensure that they are complying to the requirements that the standard has set. And for this standard, of course, remember also, they essentially provide guidelines on how you are able to effectively implement your management system, which is basically the occupational health and safety management system. So for clause 1, which is the scope, this will essentially talk about the boundaries of the standard. Basically, you're talking about the site specifications. If you are a manufacturing organization, you'll be able to state your intent for the standard. We also have the normative references, which is on clause 2. And then we have clause 3 on terms and definitions. Clause 4 for the context of the organizations. We basically talk about the environment that the organization or the company is operating in. Then on clause 5, we have the leadership and worker participation, which will basically talk about on accountability. We need leadership to be actively involved in the process, and also the worker participation and consultation. We need to ensure that each and every worker is aware of the health and safety policy that the organization has put in place. In the planning phase is now where we'll be able to explore the risks, be able to decide on how we conduct risk assessment, how we'll be able to identify the potential hazards, as well as the impact that they're likely to have if they occur. And on the support clause, which is clause 7, we are going to look into now the workers, of course. We're also going to look at the competency, the awareness on communication, how you conduct your communication, whether internally or externally, as well as the awareness that you provide within your organization based on health, occupational health and safety matters. In the operational phase, this is where now we are able to explore, for example, on the risk assessment, if you have been able to conduct, if you have been able to conduct a proper risk assessment. And this is where we'll also be able to explore if you are doing it frequently. Remember, this is not a one-off thing. And once you've determined how you're going to conduct the risk assessment, it is key that you are able to conduct it continuously to ensure that it is effective in the long run. And also, of course, ensure that you're able to improve on their performance as well. Then on performance evaluation, this is where we'll be able to evaluate the effectiveness of the control measures you've put in place. After identifying a risk and assessing its potential impacts, and then coming up, of course, to the control measures, it is up to you to be able to evaluate if the measures you've put in place are effective or they are not. If they're not effective, of course, you should be able to come up with other measures. Then on the improvements, this is now where you're able to come up with other measures, of course, based on the data you have collected from Clause 9. That is on the performance evaluation. So now we'll start with the Clause 4, which is on the context of the organization. Sorry. So on the context of the organization, here we're basically focusing on the environment surrounding the company. This will touch on the internal environment as well as the external environment. So, of course, this will also include the type of business you are operating in, be it in manufacturing, if it is in the construction sector. We're also going to focus on the licensing as well as the company structure. So one requirement within the clause 4 is identifying the needs and expectation of the workers as well as other interested parties. So like, for example, the expectation for the workers could include issuance of the PPE, or rather ensuring that there's a safe working environment within the company. For the other interested parties, of course, as we have mentioned earlier, we have the governments. They will want to see work permits, be if you are undertaking an activity within the construction sector. We also have customers such as NEMA. We have the Directorate of Occupational Safety and Health. They will also, the Directorate of Occupational Health and Safety, they will want to see if you're complying with their policies. And we also have NEMA, of course. They will want to know if you are complying with the policies that they have set for the environment. And of course, this will be provided by evidence of the licenses. So in understanding the organization contexts, we look into the external and external factors which affect the occupational health and safety. As I have mentioned, of course, on the regulatory environment, the nature of operation, as well as the workforce composition. So also in the clause 4 is where we'll be able to determine the scope. And in identifying the scope, in determining the scope, we have to identify the internal issues affecting the organization. For example, with the internal issues, we have the culture within the organization. For example, in incident reporting, if a worker has identified a potential hazard and they have reported it to the leadership or top management, or rather the representative under the health and safety, how you handle that issue will basically determine the kind of culture that the organization operates in. If you blame the staff for identifying the potential hazard, then it will create a strained relationship between the employer and the employee, whereby they will be able to, or rather they will avoid reporting on future cases. But if you are able to handle the case by providing a solution, then it will create a positive culture within the organization, whereby they'll be able to communicate or rather report similar incidences that occur in the future. And in this case, of course, will improve the performance of the organization. For the external issues, here we are able to identify them, of course, using the pestle analysis, which is short for the political, environmental, social, technological, legal, as well as the, okay, it's basically, it's an acronym. And maybe we can focus on the political environment. the government has requirements that they have set for a business operating. You'll need a business permit to operate. And if it has expired, of course, there will be significant penalties attached to that. So basically, these are what we are able to focus on. When we conduct a SWOT analysis as well as a special analysis, we'll be able to identify the internal and external issues which affect the organization. After that, we'll also be able to identify interested parties and the expectation. And when we do that, we'll be able to satisfy the clause 4, which is of the context of the organization. So, of course, after identifying the needs and interests of the interested parties, we go into the clause 5, which is on leadership and worker participation. Excuse me. So for the top here, we require that the top management demonstrate leadership by taking accountability and providing the right environment. This is where you ensure that as a leader or rather as a director within a company or even the board of directors, you do not just delegate safety to the environmental health and safety officer, or rather, even if you have a safety representative within the organization, it is up to you to ensure that you're actively involved in the process of identifying hazards, coming up with the control measures. If there are resources that are needed, maybe if their PPEs need to be replaced, if the previous ones are not in the right condition. So these are the things the leaders have to be in the know. And to be in the know, of course, you have to actively participate in the process. So, of course, we also have coming up with a policy on safety, which has to be also appropriate to the organization and commit to eliminating hazards and reducing risks. So the leadership is also responsible for assigning roles, responsibilities, and authorities. And on worker participation, we can also talk about worker consultation, whereby you don't just come up with final decisions. You are able to consult with the workers to understand what can work and what won't. In this way, of course, you'll be able to ensure that each and every staff within the organization is aware of what's going on and what can be improved. Then under the clause 6, which is on planning, this is where we talk about the risks, how we are able to identify them, and how we are able to also come up with control measures to ensure that we either reduce the likelihood of them occurring or lower their impact or lower the impact that they will have in the business operations. So, of course, the first step will be on hazard identification. This is where we are able to list what could go wrong or what would likely cause harm within the organization. Is it a physical hazard, a chemical hazard, an economic, or even a psychological hazard? For the psychological hazard, of course, this could be workplace stress or workplace bullying. Remember that one of the misconception or assumption that people have with the ISO 45001 is that it only deals with the occupational, rather the safety risks. Remember, it's an occupational and safety standard, which means that it does not only deal with safety, but also the occupational risks. For example, in workplace stress or bullying, if there's a lot of workload under one individual, this could lead to low productivity, low morale, and even affect their mental health. So the ill health part is also something that the ISO is focusing on. For the ergonomic part, of course, this is how you have designed the workplace. If you are in the manufacturing sector and you have a godown or a warehouse, does it have the necessary control measures, which includes the marking, which highlights where the forklift pathways, as well as the staff pathways, or even markings for the fire extinguishers. Basically, have you designed the organization, the facility to suit safety standards? That is what we are focusing on under that section. Then, of course, after you have identified the potential hazard, you go to the next step, which is risk assessment. This is where we are able to assess the likelihood of the risk occurring. That is based on, has it occurred in the past, and how likely is it to occur in the future? After that, we also be able to look at the impact that it will have on the business, be it reputational damage, and even in terms of injury. If the workers are injured, in terms of productivity, how will the business be affected? Even in replacing or finding other suitable workers or staff. Remember, replacing staff is also expensive. So those are some of the factors you also have to consider. So, and under the risk assessment, of course, we also have to include the contractors and the visitors. These are people, of course, who are not part of the business or other part of the day-to-day operations, but they might visit or come into the workplace once in a while. An example is we have a client, of course, who uses a checklist for each and every visitor whenever they visit. And this will, of course, include the hand giving or issuing them with the PPEs, including the helmets or even the reflector vests and under the gloves, depending on which facility they are visiting. So of course, these for the risk assessment, we also have these. Remember, all this is under the Directorate of Occupational Safety and Occupational Health and Safety, which is the DOSH, of course. And they also have a job safety analysis, which basically aligns what an organization has to comply with. The JSA is basically a checklist, and maybe you can look further into it. But this is just similar to a risk assessment, which will be able to guide you on what to look into as an organization when you're implementing the risk assessments procedure. Then, of course, under planning, we also have to understand the legal requirements. For example, the OSHA 207, which is basically the Occupational Safety Health Authority. And then we also have the Workplace Injury Benefits Authority. So you have to understand the legal requirements that your company has to comply to when in operations. Then after that, we also have the objectives. As an organization, you have to have goals that you want to achieve. And now that we are talking about the occupational health and safety, you need to have objective under this sector in terms of the safety and welfare of the staff within the organization. So this has to be consistent and measurable. Of course, it has to be consistent with the occupational health and safety policy that the organization has introduced. And also we have the criteria that it can follow, which is the SMART criteria, ensuring that or even the shift handovers, or even the shift handovers. We will want to know how you determine your internal and external communication. Remember, at the end of the day, they have to be effective, and that is the only way you can be able to certain that you are implementing the system in the correct way. Then under the documented procedures, we have, of course, the risk registers. This is, of course, from the risk assessment that has been conducted. You have to ensure that these records are controlled, meaning that they are identifiable and also not just in paperwork. You need to ensure that you have a secure system for filing these documents. So that is basically all in the support, which is clause 7. And now we can proceed to the clause 8, which is in operation. So here we'll focus on operational planning and control at the operational level. Sorry for that. So we have the permit to work systems, ensuring that you as a business, you have the valid permits, and also how you are able to manage your contractors, as well as change management, which is basically being able to determine, remember we've talked about evaluating your control measures. So say you need to improve on a certain measure. This is where you are able to, we need to see how you are able to manage such changes. Then for the emergency preparedness and response, this can be done by, of course, having drills and not just a plan on paper. This can include even the fire drills to ensure that each and every employee knows what to do or how to act in case of a fire. Or even you can have the spill drills to ensure that each and every employee is also aware of what action they need to take when a spill occurs within the organization. Under clause 8, we also have the hierarchy of controls. Remember, we've talked about risk identification and also being able to assess the impact that it would have. So the hierarchy of control is able to tell you it basically tells you what is most effective when it comes to controlling the risks. And the first step, of course, is elimination. This is the most effective method to controlling a risk that has occurred within the organization. And the elimination involves completely removing the hazard. For example, if there's an electrical hazard, the most effective way to ensure that you're able to control that risk is by disconnecting the main power supply. And then we also have substitution, which is where you replace the hazard with something safer. For example, those working in the construction industry, or they are using for those using the solvent-based paints. Remember, these are the solvent-based paints. They are very corrosive, and also in terms of when you get to inhale the whatever they emit for a long time, it will be able to affect you. So shifting from the solvent-based paint to water-based paint is also another way of ensuring that you're substituting or replacing the hazard with something safer. Then you also have engineering controls, whereby you isolate people from the hazard. This might include installing guardrails. Of course, this will also mostly affect the areas under manufacturing, whereby ensuring that your machines have guardrails, or even the stairs, they have the necessary protection. And for organizations, or rather the manufacturing industry still, we have using an exhaust vent to ensure that the dust is you're able to control the ventilation within the facility. Then another measure, of course, is the administrative control. This is whereby you change the way people work. And this might involve a policy change. For example, those working in a noisy manufacturing area, ensuring that the exposure, you can come up with an exposure of like 2 hours for each staff to ensure that they have after every 2 hours, they have a break so that to reduce the exposure they have to the noisy areas. Then on the personal protective equipment, which is basically essentially the least effective of all the controls, this is whereby you protect the worker with equipment. This can include a helmet, a reflective vest, safety boots. So it is the reason they're saying this is the least effective. Remember, it's because it only protects an individual. Remember that for a risk, we have to identify if there's a systemic failure. You have to ensure that you are not treating a risk from an individual person's perspective, but seeing if maybe as an organization, there's a policy you need to change to ensure that the risk does not occur. So this is the least effective because it does not focus on the systemic failures. Then under clause 9, which is on performance evaluation. So here we are basically focusing on monitoring, measurement, and analysis and evaluation. This is now whereby we'll be able to determine what needs to be changed. For example, we'll focus on the leading indicators, which is basically these are preventive actions that you can take. For example, conducting inspections to ensure that you are able to identify a risk or before it becomes a consequence. And then you also have the lagging indicators. But this is basically whereby you apply control measures after the outcome. After the risk has occurred, you come up with ways like, for example, you can check on the incident rates. How often has this occurred, or the impact that it has caused the business? When you're able to assess this, you'll be able to also come up with data. So of course, we also have the internal audits. Remember, under the internal audits, they are independent and they are done within the organization. So here the requirement is that you don't rely on an external body or an external auditor to come and assess your operations to maybe see if there are flaws within the system. So it's also up to to you as a company to come up with a representative body or a committee which will be able to conduct these internal audits and test whether the systems that or rather if there are flaws in the system that you have decided to work with. Then on management reviews, this is now where the top management, of course, is involved with the workers, which is also really essential to ensure that the management system is effective. So this is conducted at planned intervals, and you'll be able to actively review the system's performance to see if it's really providing the results that you intended it to provide. And also this is where the resourcing decisions are made. If probably there are resources that are required, if there's a policy change that needs to be made, this is where everything is decided. Then we have the clause 10, which is the last clause under the ISO 45001. And this basically talks about improvement. So basically this one, under the clause 10, we are acting on the data we've collected under the clause 9. Remember, we talked about on monitoring and measurement. We have the leading indicators. If you have conducted inspections, what have you obtained from the inspections? And also under the reactive, or rather the lagging indicators, which is, of course, this is after the outcome. The risk has already occurred. Now we are looking at the impact. So With this data, of course, we'll be able to decide on what changes need to be made within the system or within the organization. And we'll also be able to come up with opportunities for improvement. And in this section is where we are also able to implement them. So basically, at this point, we are correcting, preventing, and reducing undesired effects through incident investigation, corrective action reporting, and continual improvement. So this one also, of course, this is the end of the loop in the PDCA cycle, which is basically the plan, do, check, and act cycle. So of course, after you have done the improvements, which is in the act phase, we'll have to go back to planning again to identify other issues that need to be improved. So under this section, of course, we'll also look into the improvement of improving the performance of the management system, as well as the nonconformities and the corrective actions. Remember, a nonconformity is just an unfulfillment of a requirement, which is basically when you have deviated from what you had intended to achieve. So once this is identified, of course, you conduct a corrective action, which is basically a plan on how you're going to ensure that this does not recur. So we have seen, and these are some of the case studies, or rather the common issues that have been identified across major industries and companies. And so in practice, audits across manufacturing environments, they commonly surface under these main categories. We have even under the risk assessment, which you mentioned in clause 6, we can have an organization conducting a risk assessment, but never updating the process itself. This basically implies that they haven't reviewed the risks that they had determined. As per the standard, we need to ensure that this is done frequently. Then under the manufacturing, we also have the machine guarding and the lotto caps. This is whereby the workers are able to bypass the interlocks and maybe just to ensure that they speed up the production process. This might be remember, organizations are required to come up with SOPs, or rather the standard operating procedures, which are basically standardized across all the processes. So if there is a process that is being implemented on the floor, which is not part of the procedure on paper, then that is a deviation from the required operation standard. Then we also have emergency procedures being documented, but not rehearsed with the workforce. This will basically talk about the emergency, like the fire drills, whereby you're able to document the whole process, but in reality, you're not really conducting these fire drills to ensure that your staff are prepared for the situation if it occurs. Then we also have the nonconformities in operational control. Is basically creating a gap between what the procedure says and what actually happens on the floor. So this is also a gap whereby there is a discrepancy between what you have described in the standard operating procedures and what is actually happening on the ground. So after all that, of course, we now come into the implementation process. Basically, if you decide to have the standard, which is the likely process you are to take to ensure that you have achieved certification. So the first process, of course, is a gap analysis, which is where we're able to benchmark and understand the current practices within the organization. And then we compare them with what the ISO 45001 requires you to do. After that, we have the implementation, whereby we are able we come up with the policies. Of course, this is in conjunction with the organization, you come up with the policies, the risk registers, the procedures, as well as training the staff to ensure that they are aware of what they're expected to do. Then we have the internal audits and the management reviews, whereby you're able to test the system before the external audit. Then we have the stage one audits, which is basically a review of the documentation to see if the organization is ready for the certification. In the stage two, this is an on-site verification that to ensure that the system is actually working on ground. Remember, we have the paperwork, which is on the documentation. And now this is where we have to verify by physically inspecting the sites and the operations within the organization. Afterwards, we have the certification, and then, of course, the surveillance audits, which are conducted later on. So at this point, we've come to the end of the presentation. If there are any questions or anywhere you'd like to seek clarity, please channel. You can use the chat box. And also you can unmute to channel your questions. At this point, I'll hand over back to Ivy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Frank. Maybe before you leave, from the chat box, I can see three questions from Peter. Number one is, maybe you could explain more on risk register and hazard register. What's the difference? That's the first question. The second question is, how do you control a risk register, and which is an active document updated each and every time on the risks that occur? I don't know if you're noting that down. And then the third is, on work permit. Do you issue work permit to your internal maintenance or just external contractors? Maybe over to you, Frank, you can clarify those questions for Peter.
Thank you, Ivy. Thank you, Peter, for the questions. So I'll start with the first one, which is on how do you control. Okay, it's on the risk register and the hazard register, and what's the difference? Thank you, Peter, for the question. At this point, maybe from my experience, what we have worked on mostly is the risk register. For the hazard register, I really don't know if it's something that's applicable, but I'll just explain more on the risk register. So basically, the risk register is a document that contains the risks that are affecting the organization. And also, basically, you are identifying the risks. It also has a way of how are you able to assess the likelihood of it occurring. You're also looking at the potential impact it will have within the organization. So basically, you're identifying the risks, you're able to evaluate the risk, you analyze it, and also come up with control measures whereby you are able to see if they're really the measures are really effective. The DOSH, which is the Directorate of Occupational Safety, Occupational Health and Safety, that is the DOSH. They have a job. Let me just go back to the slide. They have a job safety analysis, which basically outlines what you need to identify within the risk. And also on the potential hazard, these are basically the impact that the risk will have within the organization. I'll head on to your second question, which is how do you control a risk register, which is an active document, updated each and every time?
Maybe to add on what like basically has talked about the risks and the hazard register. So the hazard is the source of the risk. An example of hazard is noise. The hazard is the noise, then the risk is developing complications from the noise. Another hazard is like maybe excessive lighting. That's another. Then the risk is developing complications from that excessive lighting. So the difference between the hazard and the risk is the hazard is the source of the risk. The hazard is the object or the process which when somebody interacts with, it can cause the risk. And frankly, you can proceed.
Thank you, Victor, for the clarification. I hope, Peter, you've noted it down. I'll proceed to the next question, which is how do you control a risk register, which is an active document, updated each and every time a risk on risk that occur? From how I am understanding this is basically you're trying to mention a risk that recurs. Maybe you'll correct me if that's not if I'm wrong, but for a risk that recurs, remember we are talking about control measures, and in this case we have the risk register. The risk register, I talked about updating it, and as an organization, of course, let's assume you have a representative, a health and safety representative, who is charged with updating the risk register. So this depends on how often they meet. It could be monthly, quarterly, or even semi-annually. So on updating the risks, of course, this will be, now that there's a recurring risk, we'll focus mostly on the control measures. Remember that under clause 9, we talked about performance evaluation, whereby you're able to assess the effectiveness of your control measures. Remember, if they're not effective, or if the measures you put in place are not able to reduce or lower the impact that the risk has, you have to come up with other ways. This also goes back, of course, to leadership and also worker consultation and participation, ensuring that top management is aware. Is it a resource that you're lacking? That's why the risk is not able to, maybe you're not able to eliminate it completely. Or rather, when we talk about worker consultation and participation, have you ensured that each and every staff has aired their input, and maybe probably they have a better idea on how this risk can be handled? So I hope I've answered your question. So on controlling the risk register, of course, it's a document in itself. And now that the risk is recurring, you definitely just have to focus on the control measures. And this will now come into the involvement, is the leadership and also other workers' participation. Then I'll now proceed to your third question, which is on the work permit. So do you issue a work permit to internal maintenance, or just external contractors? So for this, we've talked about, do you issue work permit to your internal maintenance or just external contractors? So for the standard, there are requirements for external providers. As an organization, you have to determine what you require from your suppliers. If you need them to have these documents, maybe even the work permits, that is, you can have a checklist whereby you are able to evaluate, or rather validate that the documents are legitimate. So for the work permits, for the external contractors, of course, this is something you can come up with. If it's a requirement that you have within the organization, then it's something you have to effect. Then for the internal maintenance, I don't really understand that part. Maybe you can clarify more on what you mean by internal maintenance. But for work permits, you as an organization, if you have a task that you are taking for a client, then of course you need to have a work permit. if you are maybe in the construction industry, you have to ensure that you have a work permit to ensure that you conduct on the same. Oh, Peter, you'll confirm if you're satisfied with the question, with the answers. I'm seeing your comments. You say that you're using an Excel for the risk register, and you update the severity and likelihood from time to time. And in audit, you show this Excel. How do you show that the document is controlled? Okay. Under document control, this will focus mostly on the approval and review. Remember, we talked about on clause 5 on leadership, worker consultation, as well as worker participation. So in this case, you have already collected the data, which is the risk. And now to ensure that this document is controlled, first of all, does it have a document number, which is basically, is it identifiable or attached to the company? So we need to, okay, the document has to have a document number. If you have updated the risk itself, and maybe you want to phase out the version of the risk register you're using, you can name it risk register 02 if this is the second version. Probably that is what you meant. Maybe if I haven't really answered your question satisfactorily, you can tell me. Okay, yeah, it has a document number, but is not signed. It's an Excel. At this point, maybe I'll allow Victor to assist. Just a moment.
Thanks, Franklin. So, keeping that the other register, and remember that the difference between the other risk and the risk register. The other risk is just list down there. The other, if it's noise, so just say this noise is emanating from this production plant. If it's this scope, lighting, it's emanating from maybe this machine. If it's this noise, it's emanating from this machine. Then for the risk register, it will say like what are the risks if somebody interacts with that noise. What is the likelihood and impact? What is the likelihood of a person developing hearing problems from that noise? And what is the impact if that person develops a hearing problem? What impact will it have on the company or on his life? So you are asking, how do I show this document is controlled? First of all, you have to ask yourself, where are these all these documents? We advise our clients to store their documents in a cloud-based server, like SharePoint or OnePoint or a Google Drive. The reason is we will not have to update the Excel sheet every now and then. You create an Excel sheet, you name it version 1, then you edit again, you say version 2. But if you use something like Google Drive or SharePoint, it has something called the version control. And for the version control, it will say like version 1. When was it last edited? And if that SharePoint is being used by different persons in the organization, it will even say version 1. Who edited it? An example is will say version 1 was edited by Franklin. Version 2 was edited by Victor. And what edit did he make in that document? So that's how you can show that document is controlled. Another way you can show a document is controlled is by assigning role-based access, by protecting that Excel sheet, by saying only Vista can access this Excel sheet. So you can show that by showing the role-based access control. So I advise you that Excel sheet, if it can be on SharePoint or Google Sheet, it's much more better because it has inbuilt version control. You don't have to update that file every now and then from version 1 to version 2. It will update itself um, automatically. Then there was a question I remember you asked about if the work permit you only issue to the internal maintenance or just the external contractors. So one thing for the external contractors, of course, it's non-negotiable. They have to have the work permit, which you issue to them. But even for the internal maintenance, you also have to have the work permit. So as much as they are working in the organization, they are subject to compliance. They may be working on a machine, but that does not mean it's 100% working on that machine. You can make a mistake on working on that machine, or you can make a mistake working on a plan. So even the internal maintenance team, we have to have the work permit. And the work permit we issue them according to the risk. If a certain plant has a higher risk level than a certain another plant, you have to issue a work permit for that internal maintenance team. So the work permit they can be issued to the internal maintenance and to the external contractors. But for the internal maintenance, you have to look at the risk level. The activities that have the higher risk levels, those are the ones that you should assign higher priority for issuing the permit. So yes, if you are repairing a machine at height, then that is a high risk. So we have to have a work permit. If I don't even have answered your question or you need more clarity, you can even unmute. Yes, yes. So the exact sheet has to be version control. And you can even set it. If you are able to sign to assign a certain sheet for signing, you can also do that. You can have the document number and you can also sign it. But I've told you the best option is having that Excel sheet in a cloud-based environment, like Google Sheets, SharePoint, OneDrive, Google Drive, all those cloud environments to ensure the version control. So even controlling of the risk register. If you have if it's on Google Sheets and it's online, every time you update that risk register, it will have that version control. It will say which delivery register, what was edited in that register. So Franklin, I need to confirm.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Victor, for the clarity. And I'm glad that Peter, are you satisfied with the answers? Of course, back to also the internal maintenance, as Victor had mentioned on the work permits. Remember, you mentioned the work at height. Remember, as an organization, also you conduct trainings, so ensuring that your staff have the valid licenses to operate or working at height, that can also apply in that case as work permit. It's basically on the competency. Remember, we need to demonstrate or rather have evidence that they are able to operate within those areas. So at this point, of course, I'll hand it back to Ivy, unless there's any other question. No, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Franklin, for that wonderful presentation. And I forgot to mention that this session is being recorded and the materials will be shared to you after the webinar. So what I've understood from this session is that safety is not just about posters, policies, or good intentions. It's about having a proper system. So thank you so much, Frank, for that for those insights. So maybe if there are other questions, feel free to ask. We'll be here to help you. So before we close, we'd love to hear your thoughts. So I'm going to share the poll quizzes so that you can give us your feedback. Um, so that's from the screen, you can fill in those polls. Take a minute to fill it in. So for those who are joining us for the first time, maybe let me introduce our Valuemax just for a minute. Uh, Valuemax is a consulting firm that sorry, so our mission as Valuemax is that we champion change, new ideas, new systems, new approaches, new thinking. Our vision, where we want to go as Valuemax, is delivered organizational excellence. We aspire to be a top consulting firm in Africa that is recognized for excellence, and we also aspire to deliver promises along the way. So some of the services that Valuemax provide is ISO. So we guide in implementation and certification. That is these standards that you see on your screen. And the main one that people know is ISO 9001, that is quality management systems, and all these other standards. Another service is that we offer internal audits and reviews of management systems, strategic planning, project management using Workflow that is by Blue Rock. We also set up and train on Zoho projects, transaction advisory, training in the above areas. So as Frank had mentioned about the approaches, we use a five-step approach in our engagements. First, we understand our clients' needs, and then we agree on the objectives and deliverables, and then we are going to develop an action plan that is in consultation with you, the client, and then we implement the plan. After that, we are going to discuss the findings, evaluate, and learn from the document. So we have served many clients, and among them you can see Bayana, Bravo, Farmbridge, Control Tech, Darubini. Yeah, and we look forward to also serving more and more. So our partners are Accurate Global. That is the certification body based in the USA, and we are their official representative in Kenya and East Africa region. We have also partnered with Workflowmax by Blue Rock, which is an all-in-one project management software. And we're also the first certified implementation partner in Africa. We have also partnered with Zoho, and we assist you in integrating Zoho projects into your processes seamlessly. So thank you so much for joining us today. So remember, the presentation slides will be shared with you via email after this session. So thank you so much. We have come to the end of the session. Feel free to leave